The story begins in Paris, where multiple kingdoms were divided among various rulers. Among them, Lord Pierre's kingdom was the most powerful and expansive. The scene opens in a battleground within Pierre's territory, where spectators were gathered to witness a dramatic duel between the two finest soldiers in the realm. These warriors had won countless battles for the kingdom and were the reason behind its rise. However, some shocking reasons had brought them to fight each other now. One of them was named Jean, and the other, Jack. Their hearts had grown bitter with hatred for one another, and both were eager to kill. Lord Pierre himself was present at the scene, calmly watching the confrontation unfold. To him, it was only about securing his position and expanding his rule. He didn't care who lived or died. Jean and Jack, mounted on horses, charged toward each other. But before the fight could continue, the story flashes back to earlier events, revealing how this all became possible. At that time, Pierre's kingdom was still small. Both Jean and Jack served as commanders in his army. They led troops, devised strategies, and launched tactical attacks against enemy forces. During one such battle, their army faced an overwhelming enemy. The chances of victory seemed slim. Yet, Jean and Jack had to prevent the enemy from crossing a strategic bridge that connected to their kingdom. Jean, always eager to please Lord Pierre and earn golden coins, commanded the soldiers to attack. The plan was precise, and Jack joined the fight. But during the battle, Jack was seriously injured and fell. Just as an enemy soldier was about to kill him, Jean arrived in time to save his comrade. They both got back on their feet and, along with their troops, outnumbered the enemies. After several grueling hours, they emerged victorious, though at the cost of many fallen soldiers. The loss meant they would now need to recruit more fighters. Back in the kingdom, Lord Pierre was deeply impressed by Jean's bravery. Jean had slain many enemies trying to invade their territory. Pleased, Lord Pierre promoted Jean to the position of general, making him responsible for training and strategic planning for the entire army. One night, Jack visited Jean, overjoyed that Pierre had appointed him as the kingdom's debt collector, handling all financial matters. At that time, Jean was burdened with loans and unable to repay them. He asked Jack to speak to the king on his behalf, hoping to win more battles and clear his debts. Jack promised he would try. The next day, a small enemy force appeared near their territory. It was clear that even a small unit of their army could easily defeat them. Jean requested permission to lead his best soldiers into battle, hoping to gain the king's favor. Jack disagreed, saying such a small mission didn't require elite soldiers. But Jean, desperate due to his poverty, insisted fighting was his only way to stay in the king's sight. Jean knew Jack had become Lord Pierre's favorite, especially since he managed the kingdom's finances. Despite Jack's refusal, Jean took his men and attacked the enemies. Though the opposing army was weak, Jean showed them no mercy. His aggressive behavior influenced the soldiers, who became equally brutal. Unsurprisingly, they won, and Jean returned triumphantly. That night, Jean met another king from a neighboring kingdom, Mr. Robert. Jean learned that Robert had once served in the enemy's army but had joined Pierre after their defeat. Robert had a stunning daughter named Marjorie. From the moment Jean saw her, he was captivated. Wanting to start a family of his own, Jean cleverly seduced Marjorie into falling in love with him. Jean made it clear to Marjorie's father, Robert, that he wanted to marry his daughter. Robert agreed, and they began discussing the dowry. Jean directly stated that he wanted a small piece of land near Robert's kingdom, a territory he hoped to develop into his own realm one day. Robert was initially hesitant, as the land was quite significant, but for his daughter's happiness, he promised to give it to Jean. Soon, Jean and Marjorie were married in a beautiful ceremony, and everyone celebrated the occasion with great joy. Meanwhile, Jack continued receiving promotions due to his extensive work in royal finance. Jean and Marjorie shared their first night together, but Marjorie couldn't shake her disappointment. She didn't want that piece of land, where so many of her childhood memories lived, to go to someone else. Jean reassured her that he would never give that land away. The next day brought shocking news. When Jean visited the land promised to him in the dowry, he was informed it was no longer his. It had been sold by Robert to King Pierre, who then gifted it to Jack in appreciation for his help. Jean was devastated. He had promised Marjorie he would protect that land, and now it was gone, without his knowledge. Jack approached Jean, claiming he had never asked the king for the land, it was simply gifted to him. But Jean couldn't help feeling betrayed, especially after all he had done. He filed several petitions, demanding justice and to have the land returned. But nothing worked, every request was denied. It became clear to Jean that King Pierre and Jack were working together to undermine him. Jean's only family now was his wife, Marjorie, who had brought happiness into his life. One night, she came to him and asked about the land. Jean told her the truth, that it had been taken from them despite all his efforts. He was most hurt by the fact that Jack, the friend he trusted most, hadn't truly stood by him. It now seemed like Jack had always wanted that land. Still, Jean assured Marjorie that he would fight for what was theirs, even if it meant going against the king. But then came another harsh truth. King Pierre had officially banned both Jean and Marjorie from entering the palace or court. He didn't want them causing any disruption. That meant they could no longer appeal or reclaim their land. A whole year passed, and Jean and Marjorie began living like ordinary citizens. One day, Marjorie received a letter addressed to Jean. It was from Jack, who had just had a son. He invited Jean to come celebrate. Jean didn't want to go, but Marjorie convinced him that this might be a chance to reconnect with the royal circle. Perhaps, she said, it was an opportunity for Jean to regain his influence. Eventually, Jean agreed and went to Jack's palace. By now, Jack had been granted a powerful position by King Pierre. He was in charge of all royal finances. Jean and Jack hugged, reconnecting after years apart. Jean then tried once again to catch the king's attention by volunteering for smaller military campaigns. He led his troops to swift victories, not letting enemies even touch the kingdom's territory. Despite his success, King Pierre paid little attention to him. Jean returned home from battle, tired and defeated. Only Marjorie was there to comfort and encourage him. She reminded him to stay hopeful. But Jean's health began to decline. He developed a high fever, and Marjorie insisted he stop everything and rest, that he should focus on his health. Still, Jean was determined to return to Paris and ask the king for more dangerous missions, hoping to earn enough money to support his family. Though Marjorie protested, Jean's mother supported the idea. She also dreamed of being part of the royal family and wanted her son to climb the ranks. While Jean was away at war, Marjorie felt increasingly isolated. When Jean finally returned home after several days of battle and went to see her, Marjorie was furious. She didn't even let him hug her. Jean was confused. He had only gone to earn money for her and their future. So what had happened that made Marjorie so angry? Marjorie became extremely emotional and broke down as she hugged Jean. Through her tears, she revealed something shocking. While Jean was away, Jack had come to the house. He had entered forcefully and without permission, behaving inappropriately in ways that deeply disturbed her. She was heartbroken and couldn't even express herself properly. Jean was stunned when he heard this. The first thing he did was apologize to Marjorie for not being there to protect her. But now, he vowed to make Jack pay for what he had done. This incident became a matter of pride and personal vengeance for Jean. As brave and skilled as he was on the battlefield, he was equally determined to get justice for his wife. Even if it meant standing against the king and his entire army, Jean was ready to go all the way. Jack, meanwhile, had been speaking to influential people in the kingdom to push false narratives that would make Jean look like a traitor to both King Pierre and the throne. Jean, filled with rage, challenged Jack to a one-on-one combat fight. He even received help from his mother, who gathered critical information to support his case. After thorough planning, Jean went straight to the palace and demanded a private hearing with the king. His intention was to expose Jack's crimes and ensure he faced consequences. King Pierre warned Jean that if he lost the case, he would lose everything, including the safety and future of his wife and family. But Jean accepted the risk. Days later, the court session was held. All top advisors and royal leaders were present, those who helped maintain the kingdom's power structure. Jean stood before them and laid out everything: how Jack had taken advantage of his wife, how he manipulated his way into power by building tight ties with the king, and how he stole the land that Marjorie's father had promised in the dowry. Jean called these acts what they were: serious crimes that demanded justice. Everyone in the room grew silent, taking in the weight of the accusations. But then the story shifted to Jack's perspective, revealing his true motives. From the very beginning, when Jack and Jean used to command armies together, Jack was already setting things in motion behind Jean's back. Jean thought the troops followed him into battle, but it was actually Jack who had persuaded them to go. Jack was never as strong in combat, but he had financial power, and that's what the soldiers cared about. Over time, Jack strengthened his relationship with the king, who eventually promoted him to high-ranking positions and cleared his financial debts. King Pierre knew Jack and Jean were close friends, and he also recognized Jean's exceptional combat skills. But the king intentionally kept Jean from rising too high. He feared Jean might one day challenge his authority. That's why Jack was favored, even when it came to the land Marjorie's father promised to Jean. Jack had quietly harbored resentment ever since he learned Jean was marrying Marjorie, a woman Jack had secretly admired. When he first saw her at the palace, he was completely captivated by her beauty and charm. He couldn't understand how someone as poor as Jean ended up with such a stunning wife. Throughout the celebration, Jack stayed close to Marjorie, chatting with her constantly and observing her behavior. She politely smiled back at him, which Jack misinterpreted as interest. This led Jack to believe that Marjorie wasn't truly happy with Jean. In his mind, he convinced himself that if Marjorie were with him, he could fulfill all her dreams. When Jean left for Paris to gain the king's favor again, Jack knew Marjorie would be alone, and he couldn't stop thinking about her. Unable to resist any longer, Jack went to Jean's house while Jean was still away at war. He sent one of his men to pretend to need help and trick Marjorie into opening the door. Being kind and unsuspecting, Marjorie opened it, and Jack took the opportunity to slip inside. His soldier left, and Jack confronted Marjorie directly. He confessed his feelings, saying he loved her and wanted to be close to her. Marjorie immediately refused, reminding him she had made a vow to Jean and could never betray him. But it was clear, Jack wasn't ready to take no for an answer. Jack started approaching Marjorie, and she quickly took off her shoes and ran upstairs. She tried to say no at some point, but she wasn't really stopping Jack, almost as if part of her wanted it too. It felt like Marjorie was giving him the green signal. With that, Jack jumped on her. They both intensely enjoyed the moment, and afterward, Jack got up and warned her, if she told her husband, he might leave her for good. Then, Jack left. From the outside, it was clear, Marjorie was cheating on her poor husband. Even though she would later claim Jack forced himself on her, the reality was that she was a willing participant. Maybe she truly wasn't happy with Jean. After Jean learned about it, he accused Jack of assault, which made Jack terrified of the consequences. In desperation, Jack approached King Pierre and begged for help, pleading his innocence. King Pierre was furious when he heard what Jack had done, but Jack lied, saying it wasn't true. The king started to suspect him, but still decided to help and told Jack to remain confident during the hearing. He would try to clear his name. Eventually, when things didn't work out in Jack's favor, the advice he received was to accept Jean's challenge if it came to a fight, but not to admit to the accusations. That meant if Jean challenged Jack, Jack would fight him head-on. Everything was now headed toward a showdown between Jean and Jack. Then the story shifts to Marjorie's perspective. What was her real mindset from the beginning? When Jean was engaged to her, it later came out that her father had gifted a large piece of land to Jean. At first, Jean was hesitant, but her father insisted it was for his daughter's safety. He wanted Jean to take her to that land and start a new life. Jean eventually agreed. Even on their wedding night, while Jean felt great being with Marjorie, she couldn't enjoy the moment. She lied to Jean and pretended she was happy, but the truth was she did it only out of respect for her father. As time passed, Marjorie realized Jean could never make her truly happy. His poverty and his weakness, both mentally and physically, left her unsatisfied. Then one day she met Jack in the palace. Jack had been interested in her from the start, and slowly Marjorie began to feel the same. She found Jack incredibly handsome. In fact, she'd always dreamed of marrying someone good-looking, and Jean wasn't that. So she had looked away from Jack at first, but the way he kept glancing at her at the party, and the romantic smile she returned, made it clear Marjorie liked him too. Over time, Marjorie grew increasingly unhappy, especially since Jean was always away fighting with the army. One day, while shopping in the market with her friend Mary, she saw Jack again. Jack bowed his head respectfully, and both women talked about how handsome and charming he was. That day, Marjorie's feelings for Jack grew stronger. Jack even gifted her a beautiful, and very expensive, dress. Later, when Jean returned from war and saw Marjorie wearing that revealing dress, he became furious. He asked who had given it to her, and she admitted it was Jack. Jean's anger exploded. Though he was already ill, Jean had to return to the army to restore his honor. Before leaving, he instructed his mother to keep Marjorie locked inside the house. Hearing this, Marjorie began to feel like a prisoner. She deeply regretted marrying Jean. Then came the moment when Jack could no longer hold back. He came to Marjorie's house while Jean was away and tried to force himself on her. Marjorie screamed for help and ran upstairs, but no one was around. Jack ended up sleeping with her anyway and left. For the first time in years, Marjorie experienced the pleasure she had longed for. But she also knew it was wrong. She had to get pregnant and start a family, and now she wondered if Jack had gotten her pregnant, because she was sure it could never happen with Jean. When Jean returned and learned the whole story, his rage knew no bounds. In the beginning, Jack had clearly forced himself on Marjorie, because even though she could have stopped him, Jack was far stronger. Marjorie had no way to resist him once he overpowered her. That's exactly what she tried to explain to Jean, insisting that she had never cheated on him. This leads us to the council meeting where an official decision was to be made. Jean had now directly challenged Jack to a duel, determined to take revenge. The outcome of the fight would decide who was telling the truth. Soon, everyone began to learn about what had happened between Jack and Marjorie. In a way, Jean's entire family was humiliated by the scandal. That's why it was so important now, for justice to be served and the truth to come out. We are then shown the final courtroom-like gathering. Marjorie is seated at the center, and she is pregnant. She continues to claim that Jack forced himself on her and that she was completely innocent. But Jack stands up and says that Marjorie had invited him to her room, implying it was consensual. With the situation unclear, it was almost impossible to decide who was lying. So the council finally ruled that the matter would be settled through combat between Jean and Jack. If Jean lost, it would mean Jack was telling the truth, and Marjorie would have to give up her unborn child. We then jump to the intense duel between Jean and Jack. Everyone is present as the two men prepare to fight. They draw their swords and immediately start attacking each other. Jack begins to dominate early on. He stabs Jean in the thigh, weakening him. But Jean doesn't give up. He pretends to collapse, and then, when Jack moves in, Jean attacks Jack's leg in return. Then Jean climbs on top of him and tries to drive a sword into Jack's body. Jack fights back with all his strength, but just before dying, he confesses that it was all his fault. He had gone to Marjorie's house on purpose and forced himself on her. In the next moment, Jean finally kills Jack. The truth is out. Marjorie is completely innocent. Jean embraces her, and the two are finally reunited. They are free to live their life in peace. Everyone gathers to send them off with respect, and the story ends right there.